The champagne flute sat untouched in front of Naomi Carter, its absence speaking louder than words. Around her, glasses were filled, smiles exchanged, and soft laughter rippled through the first-class cabin. Yet, she remained unnoticed, invisible in a space she had every right to occupy. Her degrees from Yale and Columbia had shielded her in courtrooms, but here at 30,000 feet, they meant nothing. The flight attendants didn't know who she was. An elite corporate attorney, a partner at one of the most powerful law firms in the country. But they would soon find out. One phone call would change everything, setting off a chain of events that would expose a reality the airline had tried to keep hidden. Naomi glanced at her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The quarterly board meeting at Hayes & Carter LLP was 6 hours away. Just enough time to land in Denver, freshen up, and walk into the conference room looking as composed as ever. In her field, there was no room for mistakes, no space for anything less than excellence, especially for someone like her, a black woman in a world where she was often the only one in the room. The terminal at Kennedy International Airport buzzed with the chaotic rhythm of business travelers glued to their phones, gate agents making hurried announcements, and luggage carts weaving through the crowds. Naomi stood out, not just because of her tailored navy suit, but because of the confidence she carried. Her natural curls were styled into an elegant updo, a choice that had once made her self-conscious in professional spaces, but now felt like an act of quiet defiance. Her phone vibrated. A message from Jonathan Hayes, the firm's founding partner and her mentor. Judge Sinclair ruled in our favor. Total victory. The client is thrilled. Details when you land. A small smile crossed Naomi's lips. The Ellison case, a 6-month battle over corporate discrimination, had been grueling. This win wouldn't just add to her reputation, it would shift the industry. A boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. Final call for Northwind Airlines Flight 368 to Denver. All zones now boarding at Gate B12. Naomi picked up her carry-on and headed toward the gate, moving past the economy passengers with her first-class boarding pass. The agent barely made eye contact as they scanned her ticket. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." The jet bridge felt like a passage between two worlds. Behind her, New York City, where she had just made legal history. Ahead, Denver, where the firm's senior partners would congratulate her. But at this moment, all she wanted was a quiet flight. As she stepped onto the plane, a blonde flight attendant greeted her with a professional yet distant smile. Her name tag read Heather. "Welcome aboard. First class is to your right." Naomi nodded, making her way to seat 2A, a window seat, with the aisle seat next to her still unoccupied. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, pulling out her phone to go through emails. The cabin filled with the usual first-class passengers, predominantly white men in tailored suits, a few white women, and Naomi. She had long grown accustomed to being the only person of color in boardrooms, 5-star hotels, and exclusive golf clubs. A middle-aged man in a charcoal suit approached her row, checked his ticket, and slid into the seat beside her with a brief nod but no greeting. Typical, Naomi thought. She returned to her emails as Heather and a younger flight attendant, Sophie, moved through the cabin, chatting warmly with passengers, sharing light jokes, and offering the kind of effortless hospitality that defined first-class service. As the economy passengers passed through, Heather and Sophie began their pre-departure drink service. "Good afternoon, can I offer you a beverage? We have champagne, orange juice, or water," Sophie asked a man across the aisle. "Champagne, please," the businessman responded without looking up from his laptop. Sophie continued down the row, reaching Naomi's aisle. She leaned toward the man beside her first. "Sir, would you like a pre-departure beverage? Champagne, orange juice, or water?" "Champagne, thanks." He closed his leather portfolio without acknowledging Naomi. Sophie nodded, turned, and moved on to the next row without offering Naomi anything. A familiar tightness formed in Naomi's chest. Not shock, just the weary recognition of a pattern. She took a slow breath, reminding herself that maybe it was an oversight. Maybe. But deep down she already knew better. Naomi Carter exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe Sophie, the younger flight attendant, had simply been distracted. But deep down, Naomi knew better. From her seat in Northwind Airlines' first-class cabin, she observed as Heather, the senior flight attendant, made her way down the aisle with practiced ease, distributing hot towels to each passenger. She smiled, nodded, exchanged pleasantries, until she reached Naomi's row. Without breaking stride, she handed a towel to the man beside Naomi and moved on without acknowledgement. That was no accident. Naomi had experienced too many of these subtle exclusions to believe otherwise. The averted gazes, the forced neutrality, the carefully curated slights that could be dismissed as simple oversight if challenged. It was a familiar script. A moment later, Sophie returned with a tray of champagne flutes, gracefully placing them on passengers' tray tables. She reached the man next to Naomi, served him his drink, then turned and walked away. Naomi's hands curled into fists beneath the polished wooden table of her seat. It wasn't about the champagne. She didn't even particularly want it, but she understood what this was, an unspoken message. You don't belong here. Even now, after everything she had accomplished, a law degree from Yale, a 7-figure income, and a partnership at Hayes & Carter LLP, she was still being reminded, in the smallest and most insidious ways, that to some people, she would always be an outsider. For a brief moment, she considered letting it go. It would be easier. It was always easier. But not today. She pressed the call button. It took only a few seconds for Sophie to appear, her professional smile firmly in place. Yes, ma'am? I wasn't offered a pre-departure drink, Naomi said, her voice calm, controlled. Sophie blinked, the practiced expression on her face faltering for a split second before she recovered. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. What would you like? Champagne, please. Let me check if we have any left, Sophie replied, turning away before Naomi could respond. Naomi remained silent, watching as Sophie disappeared toward the galley. A glance at the cart revealed the truth. There was still a half-full bottle of champagne in plain sight. The man beside Naomi took a slow sip from his glass, pretending not to notice the exchange. Fine, she thought. If they wanted to play this game, she'd play it her way. She reached for her phone, navigating to Northwind Airlines' customer service section. Years of experience had taught her that vague complaints were dismissed, but detailed documentation, that had power. She opened her notes app and began typing. Flight 368, New York to Denver. Cabin crew, Heather Collins Sr., Sophie Mitchell, Jr. Incident, deliberate exclusion from pre-departure beverage service. Documented champagne availability. Time, 6:45 p.m. EST. Specifics mattered. Facts mattered. And Naomi Carter knew exactly how to leverage them. A few minutes later, Sophie returned. She placed a plastic cup of water on Naomi's tray table. I'm sorry. We're out of champagne, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Naomi tilted her head slightly, glancing toward the galley where the bottle still sat, half full and untouched. Then she looked back at Sophie. I see, she said, her tone cool but deliberate. Sophie hesitated for half a second before walking away. Naomi's phone buzzed with a new message from Jonathan Hayes. Clients thrilled. We'll discuss next steps when you land. She took a steadying breath, forcing her focus back on her work. But the quiet simmer of indignation remained. The cabin doors closed and the safety demonstration began. The plane pushed back from the gate, but Naomi's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't letting this go. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. Rough day? He asked, his voice low. Naomi turned her head slightly, studying him. You could say that. I'm Ethan Sinclair, he offered, extending a hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking it. Naomi Carter. Ethan cleared his throat, glancing toward the aisle where Heather and Sophie moved through the cabin. I couldn't help but notice what just happened, he said carefully. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Did you? Yeah, and it was unacceptable. Naomi studied him more closely now. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, a suit that spoke of quiet wealth. His watch, Patek Philippe, not a flashy Rolex, suggested old money, not new. Her experience had taught her to be skeptical of sudden allies. People witnessed discrimination all the time, but when it came time to corroborate a complaint, they often developed convenient amnesia. Yes, it was, she said evenly, not revealing her plans. Ethan nodded slowly. If you decide to report it, I'd be happy to back you up. That surprised her. And why is that? Because I've seen this kind of thing happen before, he said, voice measured. And it's not right. Naomi considered his words. She had no reason to trust him. But perhaps, just this once, an unexpected witness might make all the difference. She glanced down at her phone, at the notes she had typed. Then she locked eyes with Ethan and gave him the smallest nod. Good to know. The plane soared into the sky, but Naomi was already planning her next move. Naomi Carter accepted Ethan Sinclair's business card with a measured nod, her fingers closing around the thick cardstock. Senior VP at Sinclair & Associates, Luxury Hospitality Consulting. An ally, perhaps. But experience had taught her not to rely on promises made in passing. I appreciate it, she said, slipping the card into her purse. The plane had landed in Denver, but Naomi's mind was still cataloging every moment of the flight, every slight, every intentional omission. Every quiet reminder that no matter how accomplished she was, there were still places where she was expected to shrink into the background. As the flight reached cruising altitude earlier, she had been prepared for the subtle ways Heather Collins and Sophie Mitchell continued their performance of exclusion. But when Heather dropped Naomi's hot towel onto the floor, muttered a half-hearted, "Oops, sorry," and walked away without replacing it, any lingering benefit of the doubt disappeared. Beside her, Ethan had sucked in a breath. Okay, that was blatant. Naomi had only smiled dryly. Welcome to my world. Ethan hesitated before asking, does this happen often? Naomi had given him a long, assessing look. Most well-meaning people, especially those cushioned by privilege, assumed these moments were rare, outliers rather than patterns. More often than you'd think, she replied. Usually with more subtlety, but the message is the same. Ethan had shaken his head, his expression troubled. I'm sorry, that sounds exhausting. It is, Naomi had admitted, surprised by the way he acknowledged it so easily. But it's also part of navigating spaces that weren't designed with me in mind. The next indignity had come during the drink service. Sophie had approached with the cart, her tone cheerful. Something to drink, sir? Ethan had ordered sparkling water. Sophie had nodded and made to move on, pointedly ignoring Naomi. Ethan had leaned back slightly, his voice casual but deliberate. And I believe my roommate would like something as well. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed Sophie's face before she turned stiffly toward Naomi. Of course. What would you like? Red wine, Naomi had said evenly. Sophie had reached for a plastic cup. Actually, Ethan had interrupted again, his voice light but firm. First-class passengers receive proper glassware, don't they? Sophie had frozen, her face flushing. Of course, my mistake. She had poured the wine into a glass, placed it on Naomi's tray without a word, and moved on. Naomi had tilted her head slightly, considering Ethan. Thank you for the solidarity, but you don't need to fight my battles. I'm not, he had replied simply. I'm ensuring service standards are maintained for all passengers. Professional courtesy. I'm in the hospitality consulting business. Naomi had let out a quiet chuckle. Well, Northwind Airlines could certainly use your services. But the pattern continued. During meal service, Naomi had been served last. When she requested a second glass of wine, Sophie had claimed they were out, only to pour a fresh glass for a passenger 2 rows ahead moments later. When she asked for a blanket, it never arrived. Every moment, every deliberate omission, was another entry in the meticulous file she was building. Ethan had grown increasingly outraged. I've never seen such unprofessional behavior, he muttered when Sophie forgot Naomi's coffee for the 3rd time. It happens more often than you'd think, Naomi had said again, just usually with more finesse. The conversation had eventually shifted to their professional lives. We work with high-end hospitality brands, Ethan had explained. Hotels, private aviation, first-class airline services. We actually consult for several major carriers. Not Northwind Airlines, though, Naomi had noted dryly. No, he admitted, shaking his head, though they could clearly use it. Naomi had shared that she was a partner at Hayes & Carter LLP, specializing in corporate law with a focus on discrimination cases. Ethan's eyebrows had lifted slightly. Hayes & Carter, as in Jonathan Hayes? That's the one, Naomi had confirmed. He recruited you straight out of law school, didn't he? He did. He's been an incredible mentor. And you handled discrimination cases, Ethan had mused, realization dawning in his expression. So this flight is unfortunately familiar territory. Naomi had smiled wryly, both personally and professionally. As the plane began its descent into Denver, Naomi had excused herself to use the lavatory. When she returned, she noticed Heather and Sophie whispering in the galley, occasionally glancing in her direction before snickering. She had seen enough. Sliding into her seat, Naomi had taken out her phone and pulled up a contact she rarely used, but always kept for moments like this. Jonathan Hayes. She typed a quick message. Jonathan, I need to speak with you as soon as we land. Blatant discrimination on Northwind Flight 368. Fully documented. This isn't just about me. The reply came almost instantly. Call me the moment you're off the plane. Naomi had locked her phone and slipped it into her jacket pocket, a grim satisfaction settling over her. She had spent years building her career, her reputation, her network, climbing a ladder that had never been designed for people like her. Today, she was going to use that power. The plane touched down, and as passengers prepared to disembark, Naomi noticed neither Heather nor Sophie met her gaze during the landing announcements. When the seatbelt sign flicked off, Ethan had turned to her one last time, pulling a card from his wallet. Let me know if you need a witness statement, he had said. What happened today was unacceptable. Naomi had taken the card and tucked it away. I just might. She waited until most of the passengers had deplaned before standing, adjusting the strap of her carry-on bag. As she approached the exit, Heather stood by the door with her artificial flight attendant's smile. Thank you for flying with us, she said to each passenger. But when Naomi reached her, the smile dropped. Naomi paused, her expression unreadable. I'd like your full name and employee ID number, please. Heather's eyes widened slightly before narrowing. Why would you need that? Naomi's smile was cool, professional. Professional courtesy. I'd like to make sure you're properly identified in my complaint. Heather scoffed. For what exactly? Naomi tilted her head. For discriminatory treatment based on race. Her voice carried just enough to make the nearby crew members glance over. I'm sure Northwind Airlines' legal team will be in touch. Without waiting for a response, she walked up the jet bridge, her head held high. The moment she stepped into the terminal, she dialed Jonathan's number. He answered on the first ring. Naomi? He said, his voice steady but edged with something colder. Tell me everything. And she did. Naomi Carter stepped off the plane with her head held high, her grip tightening around her carry-on. The air in the jet bridge felt cooler than the cabin, but it did little to temper the heat simmering in her chest. At the exit, Heather Collins stood in her crisp uniform, her customer service smile plastered in place as she offered automatic farewells. Thank you for flying with us today, she said to each departing passenger. But when Naomi approached, the warmth in Heather's expression vanished. Instead of looking at her, she stared past her, as though she were invisible. Naomi stopped. I'd like your full name and employee ID number, she said, her voice even. Heather's eyes widened slightly before narrowing. Why would you need that? Professional courtesy, Naomi replied smoothly. I want to ensure you're properly identified in my complaint. Heather scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Complaint? For what exactly? Discriminatory treatment based on race, Naomi said, her tone carrying just enough weight to make nearby crew members glance in their direction. I'm sure Northwind Airlines' legal team will be in touch. Heather opened her mouth to respond, but Naomi had already turned away, walking up the jet bridge without a second glance. She didn't need an argument. She needed action. As soon as Naomi reached the terminal, she pulled out her phone and dialed Jonathan Hayes. He answered on the first ring. Naomi. Tell me everything, he said, his voice sharp and steady. For the next 5 minutes, she recounted the details with the same precision she used in court. No embellishments, no gaps, just facts. The deliberate exclusion from service, the refusal to acknowledge her presence, the repeated microaggressions. Jonathan listened without interruption. When she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. This ends today. There was something cold in his voice. Richard Davenport is an old friend of mine, he added. Naomi's eyebrows lifted slightly. Richard Davenport, the CEO of Northwind Airlines, wasn't just a name in the industry, he was one of its power players. I'm calling him now, Jonathan continued. Go to your hotel, prepare for tomorrow's board meeting, and leave this with me. By this time tomorrow, those flight attendants will be looking for new jobs. Naomi hesitated. It's not just about them losing their jobs, Jonathan, she cautioned. It's about the culture that made them think they could get away with it. Jonathan's voice softened slightly. Trust me, Naomi. By the time I'm done, this will be a case study in consequences. Davenport knows better than to let this slide. As Naomi stepped outside and hailed a taxi, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Justice was necessary, but she knew better than most that firing a few employees rarely addressed the deeper systemic rot. Still, accountability had to start somewhere. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Jonathan. Davenport is furious, wants to speak with you personally. Damage control, already beginning. Naomi let out a slow breath as the taxi pulled away from the curb. The champagne she had been denied seemed trivial now compared to the reckoning that was about to unfold. Across the city, Richard Davenport sat in his corner office on the 40th floor of Northwind Airlines headquarters. The Denver skyline stretched out before him through floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed it. The phone call from Jonathan Hayes had left him rattled. 30 years in the airline industry had taught him how to handle customer complaints, labor disputes, even PR disasters. But this was different. Naomi Carter wasn't just any passenger. She was a partner at one of the most influential law firms in the country, one with a reputation for taking on high-profile discrimination cases. More importantly, she was a close associate of Jonathan Hayes, whose investment firm held a significant stake in Northwind Airlines' parent company. This wasn't just a customer service failure. It was a potential catastrophe. Richard paced his office, running a hand through his graying hair. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his grandfather, a pioneering black pilot who had fought for his place in the industry when commercial aviation was still largely closed to people of color. The irony wasn't lost on him. His grandfather had endured outright racism to fly commercial planes, and now, decades later, a black woman in first class was still experiencing exclusion, just in a more subtle form. A buzz from his intercom interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, Linda Monroe is here. Send her in." Linda, Northwind's chief of customer experience, stepped into the office, her expression tense. "I assume you've heard," Richard said, gesturing for her to sit. "Yes," Linda replied, already pulling out her tablet. A first-class passenger on Flight 368 reported blatant racial discrimination by the cabin crew. "Not just any passenger," Richard corrected. "Naomi Carter, partner at Hayes & Carter." Linda's face paled slightly. "As in Jonathan Hayes?" Richard nodded grimly. "The very same." Linda exhaled. "I need to launch a full investigation. Crew statements, passenger accounts, security footage from the cabin. I want those flight attendants grounded until further notice," Richard interrupted. "Understood." Linda was already typing. "Do we have specifics of the allegations?" Richard recounted what Jonathan had told him, watching as Linda's expression darkened. "This is extensive," she said finally. "And intentional." "Exactly," Richard agreed. Jonathan had warned him this would be a case study in consequences. Richard intended to make sure of that. Richard Davenport stood by the window of his office, staring out over the Denver skyline. His reflection in the glass was rigid, his jaw set. The situation had gone from bad to worse. He had spent years crafting Northwind Airlines' reputation, an industry leader in diversity and inclusion. At least, that's what the press releases said. But he knew the truth. Corporate policies could be rewritten overnight, but changing the people who enforced them? That was another matter entirely. His phone buzzed on his desk. "Jonathan, Naomi is willing to speak with you at 4 p.m. Don't make me regret setting this up." Richard exhaled sharply. He texted back his confirmation, then hit the intercom. "Cancel my remaining appointments and get me the HR files for Heather Collins and Sophie Mitchell from Flight 368. Now." 20 minutes later, Rachel Simmons, the airline's head of human resources, stepped into his office, a thick folder in hand. A 20-year veteran, Rachel had seen Northwind Airlines evolve from an exclusive old boys club into the appearance of a modern, inclusive workplace. But appearances, as today had proven, weren't enough. She placed the files on his desk. "What am I looking for?" Richard asked, already flipping through Heather's records. "Any complaints, performance issues, a pattern," he said, "and I want complete honesty about how these have been handled." Rachel hesitated. "You should know Heather has friends in senior management." Richard looked up sharply. Meaning? Meaning some complaints may have been downplayed over the years, Rachel admitted. His jaw tightened. That ends today. If there's been misconduct, I want all of it in front of me now. For the next hour they went through the files. Heather's record was troubling. There were multiple complaints of dismissive or rude behavior toward passengers, nothing explicitly labeled as racial bias, but the patterns were impossible to ignore. Many of the names in the complaints suggested passengers of color. Richard tapped a report from 3 years ago. Look at this, he said. A complaint filed by Dr. Amir Shah about discriminatory service, dismissed as unsubstantiated after a single interview with Heather. Rachel frowned. That would have been under William Fletcher's supervision. He and Heather are close. Too close for proper oversight, apparently, Richard muttered. Sophie's file was thinner, reflecting her short tenure, just over 2 years. No formal complaints, but her supervisor had noted concerns about her being too easily influenced by senior crew members. Richard closed the files. Heather is suspended immediately, pending termination review. Sophie goes on administrative leave while we determine the extent of her involvement. Rachel hesitated. That will cause waves. Heather has a lot of support in the company. Then they can support her in her job search, Richard said coldly. I won't have employees treating our passengers differently based on race, no matter who they know. At that moment his phone buzzed again. Linda Monroe. Security footage confirms everything. Blatant differential treatment. 2 first-class passengers have already corroborated Naomi Carter's account. This is bad. Richard exhaled and forwarded the message to Rachel. Make the calls now, he said. Rachel nodded and left, her expression grim. Richard turned back to the window, thinking about his upcoming conversation with Naomi Carter. This wasn't just a PR crisis. This was a reckoning. Heather Collins paced the cramped airline crew lounge, her uniform jacket discarded on a chair. Her manicured nails drummed against her arms as she folded them across her chest. This is ridiculous, she hissed. Across from her, Sophie Mitchell sat frozen, her face pale as she stared at the official email they had both received 30 minutes ago. They can't just ground us over one passenger's complaint, Heather continued, her voice rising. Sophie finally looked up, her expression unreadable. They did, she said flatly. Heather scoffed. She was being difficult from the start, demanding special treatment. Sophie swallowed hard. No, she wasn't, she said quietly. She asked for the same things everyone else got. Heather stopped pacing. Excuse me, she said, her voice dangerously low. Sophie hesitated. You're the one who told me to. She trailed off. Heather's eyes narrowed. Told you to what? Sophie took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. To put her in her place. Sophie Mitchell felt the heat of shame rising in her face, but she didn't look away. Those were your exact words, she said, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. You told me to put her in her place. Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Across the crew lounge, Heather Collins finally slumped into a chair, rubbing her temples. I didn't mean it like that, she muttered, but even to her own ears, the excuse sounded weak. Sophie didn't let up. Then how did you mean it? She demanded, stepping forward, because from where I was standing it looked exactly like what she's accusing us of. Heather exhaled sharply, her frustration twisting into something almost desperate. 1 complaint in 15 years, she muttered. And now they're threatening to fire me? It's not fair. Sophie let out a bitter laugh. Fair? She echoed. Was it fair what we did to her? Was it fair that I followed your lead instead of doing what I knew was right? Heather said nothing. Sophie grabbed her bag. I have a meeting with HR in 20 minutes, she said flatly. I suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say because I'm done covering for you. As the door closed behind her, Heather's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Northwind Airlines Human Resources. Her stomach twisted. Taking a deep breath, she answered. Heather Collins. Miss Collins, this is Rachel Simmons from HR, came the cool, professional voice on the other end. I'm calling to inform you that, effective immediately, you are suspended pending an investigation into allegations of discriminatory conduct on Flight 368 today. You are required to attend a formal review hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. at headquarters. Heather's grip on her phone tightened. Suspended? Without even hearing my side of the story? You will have the opportunity to present your account at tomorrow's hearing, Rachel replied, her tone even. In the meantime, please surrender your crew ID to airport operations before leaving the premises. The call ended before Heather could argue. She stared at her phone in disbelief. 15 years of flawless service, and now her entire career was hanging by a thread, all because that woman couldn't accept the way things worked in first class. Her mind immediately went to William Fletcher, her longtime ally in senior management. He had smoothed over complaints before. Surely he could do the same now. She dialed his number, straight to voicemail. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. William always answered her calls. For the first time, it occurred to Heather that she might not be able to talk her way out of this one. Sophie Mitchell sat across from Rachel Simmons, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The stark conference room felt sterile, a far cry from the familiarity of the aircraft cabin. She had changed out of her uniform into a simple blouse and slacks, but it didn't make her feel any less exposed. Rachel sat across from her, taking notes, her expression unreadable. So Heather specifically instructed you to skip Miss Carter during the pre-departure beverage service? Rachel clarified. Sophie nodded, shame heating her cheeks. She said, don't bother with 2A. Let's see how long it takes her to notice. Rachel's pen moved smoothly over the paper. And when Miss Carter pressed the call button? Heather told me to take care of it, but to make it clear she wasn't getting special treatment. Rachel looked up. And the champagne? Was there actually none left, as you told her? Sophie dropped her gaze. No, we had plenty. Rachel's pen paused mid-stroke. Did Heather say anything specific about why she wanted Miss Carter treated differently? Sophie swallowed hard. She said, people like that always want what they haven't earned. Rachel's eyes flicked up sharply. People like that? Sophie nodded slowly. I think she meant black people. The weight of the words settled between them. Rachel set her pen down. Have you witnessed Heather make similar comments before? Sophie hesitated. Nothing this blatant, she admitted. But yes, she serves certain passengers last, is less attentive, makes comments under her breath. Rachel studied her. Why didn't you report it? Sophie bit her lip. Heather's been flying for 15 years. She has influence with scheduling managers. If a new flight attendant crosses her, they get the worst routes and shifts. Rachel made another note. Thank you for your honesty, Sophie, she said. I need to ask, did you agree with Heather's actions, or did you simply follow her lead? Sophie felt tears threaten, but she held them back. I followed her lead, and I'm ashamed of that, but I don't agree with what we did. It was wrong. Miss Carter deserved better. Did you at any point attempt to provide Miss Carter with the service she requested against Heather's instructions? Sophie shook her head. No, and that's on me. I was worried about my job, but that's no excuse. Rachel sat back, exhaling slowly. You understand that your actions, regardless of whether they were initiated by Heather, violated multiple company policies, as well as federal anti-discrimination laws. Sophie nodded. I understand. Rachel studied her for a long moment. The investigation is ongoing, and final decisions haven't been made. I suggest you use this time to reflect on how you might have handled the situation differently. Sophie nodded, her throat tight. I already have. Sophie Mitchell sat frozen in the HR office, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. You understand that your actions, whether initiated by you or Heather Collins, violate multiple company policies, as well as federal anti-discrimination laws? The words from Rachel Simmons echoed in her mind, each syllable landing like a weight in her chest. She nodded, a single tear escaping despite her efforts to hold it back. Yes, I understand. If I'm terminated, I just want you to know, I'm truly sorry, and this isn't who I want to be. Rachel studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, her features softened, just slightly. Your honesty will be noted in my report, she said. The investigation is ongoing, and final decisions haven't been made. I suggest you take this time to reflect on how you could have handled this differently. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. As she stepped out of the HR office, she released a shaky breath. She had told the truth. Now, she had to wait and see if it would be enough. Rachel Simmons sat at her desk, reviewing her notes from the interviews. The contrast between Sophie's remorseful confession and Heather's defensive, evasive responses was striking. Heather had denied any discriminatory intent, attempting instead to frame Naomi Carter as a demanding, entitled passenger who had misinterpreted standard service variations. Her story didn't hold up, not against Sophie's testimony, not against the accounts of 3 other passengers who had witnessed the deliberate slights. Rachel picked up her phone and dialed Richard Davenport's direct line. He answered immediately. "What have you found?" "It's as bad as we thought," Rachel said. "Possibly worse. We have a documented pattern of behavior with Collins, and Mitchell has confirmed explicit discriminatory intent." There was a sharp exhale on the other end of the line. "Termination for both?" Richard asked. Rachel hesitated. "Collins, absolutely. But Mitchell is more complicated. She's admitted fault, shown genuine remorse, and provided critical insight into how senior crew members wield informal power over scheduling." "Your recommendation?" Richard asked. "Suspension without pay, mandatory comprehensive retraining, and probationary status for 12 months, Rachel said. "And we need a full audit of our crew scheduling practices." A long silence followed. "Proceed with termination for Collins," Richard finally said. "And for Mitchell, implement your recommendation, but add one condition, a personal apology to Miss Carter if she's willing to receive it." Rachel made a note. "Understood. And what about William Fletcher? The evidence suggests he may have been protecting Collins from previous complaints." Richard's voice hardened. "Schedule a meeting with him tomorrow morning. If he's been suppressing discrimination complaints, he'll be joining Collins in the unemployment line." In her hotel room, Naomi Carter sat at her desk, flipping through the notes for her board meeting. But her mind kept drifting back to the flight, the small but calculated humiliations, the silent refusals. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, a young hotel employee stood there, holding a polished gift basket and an envelope with the Northwind Airlines logo. "Delivery for Miss Carter," the woman said with a professional smile. Naomi accepted it, tipped the staff member, and closed the door. Inside the basket was an array of expensive peace offerings, premium chocolates, luxury spa products, and, at the center, a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. The irony nearly made her laugh. She opened the envelope, unfolding a handwritten note on Northwind Airlines executive stationery. "Miss Carter, please accept my sincere apologies for your experience aboard Northwind Airlines today. There is no excuse for the treatment you received, and I take personal responsibility for the failure of our crew to uphold the standards of respect and dignity that every passenger deserves. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly about this matter. Jonathan Hayes has suggested 4 p.m. today, and I have confirmed this timing with him. Please call my direct line at your convenience. With deepest regrets, Richard Davenport, CEO, Northwind Airlines." Naomi set the note down next to her laptop. She had no interest in champagne or apologies, only in meaningful change. Her phone buzzed. "Jonathan." "The CEO sent an apology package," she told him as she picked up. "Dom Perignon, no less." Jonathan chuckled, his deep voice carrying through the line. Davenport always did have a flair for the grand gesture. "But don't be fooled, he's taking this very seriously." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Why?" "Because his grandfather was William Davenport," Jonathan said. Naomi blinked. "As in the pilot from the 1960s discrimination case?" "The very same." A memory stirred, one of the first legal cases she had studied in law school. William Davenport had been one of the first black commercial pilots in the U.S., facing systemic racism at every turn. His case against a major airline had set legal precedents, still cited today. "Richard doesn't talk about it publicly," Jonathan continued, "but his grandfather's legacy is a significant part of why he's in the industry. This situation, it's personal for him." Naomi exhaled slowly. "Interesting. He wants to speak with you at 4 p.m., Jonathan added. "I think you should take the call." Naomi hesitated. "What exactly are you hoping will come from this?" Jonathan's voice softened. "The same thing I've always hoped for, that the next generation of black professionals won't have to fight the same battles we did. That competence and achievement will be enough. That first class will mean first-class treatment for everyone." He paused before adding, "But I'm a pragmatist, Naomi. These changes happen in small steps, built on moments like this one." Naomi stared at the champagne bottle. One moment had led to this. A meeting with a CEO who had the power to do more than apologize, if he had the will to. She picked up her phone, glanced at the time, and then dialed the number from Richard Davenport's note. He answered on the first ring. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice careful but steady. "Thank you for calling." Naomi took a breath. "Let's talk." After hanging up with Jonathan Hayes, Naomi Carter returned to her board meeting preparations. But her mind kept circling back to the events of the day. The champagne itself was trivial, almost absurdly so. But it wasn't about the champagne. It was about the message behind the denial, the quiet but deliberate assertion that she didn't belong. At exactly 4 p.m., Naomi picked up her phone and dialed the number on Richard Davenport's note. "Miss Carter," he answered immediately, his tone controlled but weighted with something else, concern, perhaps even urgency. "Mr. Davenport," Naomi responded, her voice crisp. "Thank you for taking my call. I cannot express strongly enough how disturbed I am by what occurred on your flight today," he said, skipping the pleasantries. Naomi remained professional. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm more interested in actions than apologies." "As am I," he assured her. "The flight attendants in question have been suspended pending investigation, but based on the evidence we've gathered, including passenger statements and security footage, termination proceedings are already underway for Heather Collins. Sophie Mitchell's situation is being handled differently, as she has fully cooperated and admitted her role." Naomi hadn't expected such swift action. "That's thorough," she admitted. "It has to be," Richard said gravely. "What happened to you today isn't just a failure of customer service, it's a violation of our core values. More importantly, it's a violation of basic human dignity." Naomi listened carefully. This wasn't just corporate damage control. He meant it. But then, he added something that made her sit up a little straighter. "That said, firing 2 employees doesn't fix the underlying problem." "Go on," she said, intrigued. "I'd like to invite you to participate in a comprehensive review of our crew training protocols, specifically regarding unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity," Richard continued. "Your perspective, as both a legal expert and someone who has experienced discrimination firsthand, would be invaluable." That wasn't what Naomi had expected. Most corporate executives responded to incidents like these with a PR script, issuing vague promises before trying to sweep things under the rug. "That's an interesting proposition," she said cautiously. "But I have to ask, is this just a PR strategy to mitigate legal exposure?" Richard chuckled, surprising her. "Miss Carter, I'm well aware of your reputation. If you decided to pursue legal action against Northwind, a consulting role wouldn't deter you." She smirked slightly. He wasn't wrong. "No," he continued, "this isn't about PR. My grandfather was one of the first black commercial airline pilots in this country. His photo hangs in my office as a daily reminder that the opportunities I've had came at a tremendous cost to those who came before me." Naomi sat back, absorbing that information. "I didn't know that about your family history." "Few do," Richard admitted. "I don't usually lead with it, but it informs my approach to these issues." "What happened to you today?" "That's a failure I take personally. I'm proposing a collaboration, not a cover-up." Naomi considered his words carefully. "I'd need to see specifics, proposed changes, implementation timelines, accountability metrics." "Of course," Richard assured her. "I'll have a preliminary proposal sent to your office by tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, Linda Monroe, our Chief of Customer Experience, would like to meet with you in person to take your full statement and discuss immediate remedial steps." By the time they ended the call 30 minutes later, Naomi had tentatively agreed to consult on Northwind's diversity training overhaul. But she made it clear, if their response proved inadequate, she wouldn't hesitate to pursue other avenues. As she prepared for bed that night, her phone buzzed. "Jonathan, Davenport tells me you're considering his proposal." "Smart move on his part. Keep me posted." Naomi allowed herself the smallest of smiles. For once, an experience of discrimination wouldn't just result in personal vindication, it might actually create systemic change, and that was worth more than all the champagne in first class. At 7 a.m., William Fletcher, Vice President of Crew Operations, opened his inbox to find a calendar invitation for an urgent 8 a.m. meeting with Richard Davenport. He assumed it was about contract negotiations with the flight attendants union. He couldn't have been more wrong. When William entered Richard's office, he found not only the CEO, but also Rachel Simmons from HR waiting for him. The tension in the air was unmistakable. This wasn't a negotiation. Richard wasted no time. "We're investigating a serious incident of racial discrimination by a flight attendant on yesterday's Flight 368, he said. "Heather Collins is the primary offender, but our investigation has uncovered something else of concern." William kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. "What might that be?" he asked, feigning calm. Richard slid a folder across the desk. "This contains 5 separate complaints against Collins over the past 3 years, all suggesting discriminatory behavior," he said. "Each one was reviewed by you and each was dismissed as unsubstantiated, without a proper investigation." A muscle twitched in William's jaw. "Personnel matters require discretion," he said smoothly. "Not every passenger complaint warrants a full-scale investigation." Rachel leaned forward, flipping the folder open to a highlighted report. "This complaint from Dr. Amir Shah specifically mentions being ignored during pre-flight service while white passengers received champagne," she said. "Your entire investigation consisted of a single conversation with Collins. No other witnesses were interviewed." Richard's tone darkened. "This isn't an isolated case, William. It's a pattern." William forced himself to maintain composure. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Richard said, his voice cold. "I'm stating facts. You failed to properly investigate multiple discrimination complaints against an employee with whom you have a personal friendship. That constitutes a serious breach of your professional responsibilities." William inhaled sharply. "If you're implying I've shown favoritism—" "The evidence implies it quite clearly," Rachel interjected, pointing to another notation in the file. Richard didn't let him recover. "You have a choice," he said. "Resignation or termination. Either way, your employment with Northwind Airlines ends today." William's fists clenched. "After 23 years?" he hissed. "For this?" Richard met his glare evenly. "For failing to uphold the most basic standards of fairness and equal treatment," he said. "For protecting an employee who discriminated against passengers based on race. For betraying the trust placed in you as a senior executive of this company." William stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "You'll be hearing from my attorney. This is wrongful termination." Rachel didn't even flinch. "Actually," she said calmly, "it's entirely justified under our ethics policy, which you sign annually. But by all means, pursue legal action. I imagine discovery will be fascinating." William's bluster deflated. Having years of his decisions scrutinized in a legal proceeding was a risk he clearly wasn't willing to take. After a long silence, he muttered, "I'll clear out my office." As soon as the door closed behind him, Richard turned to Rachel. "Make sure his system access is revoked immediately, and I want a comprehensive review of all discrimination complaints handled by his department for the past 5 years." Rachel nodded. "Already underway." Richard exhaled. For Northwind Airlines, this wasn't just about one flight. It was about rooting out a toxic culture that had been allowed to fester for far too long. William Fletcher sat stiffly across from Richard Davenport, his fingers pressing into the armrests of his chair. Across the desk, Rachel Simmons flipped through a folder, her expression unreadable. "Every passenger complaint doesn't warrant a full-scale investigation," William argued, his voice tight. "Discrimination complaints do," Rachel interjected, her tone firm. "Our policy is explicit. Every allegation of discriminatory treatment must be investigated with statements taken from all involved parties and witnesses." That didn't happen in these cases. William's jaw clenched. "Heather has been an exemplary employee for 15 years. Richard cut him off, his voice cold. "Her record now includes termination for documented racial discrimination against a first-class passenger who happens to be a partner at Hayes & Carter, one of the most powerful law firms in the country. A passenger who documented every interaction and has multiple witnesses corroborating her account." A flicker of panic flashed across William's face. "Hayes & Carter?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Jonathan Hayes' firm," Richard confirmed. "But that's not the issue here, William. The issue is that one of our flight attendants felt comfortable engaging in blatant racial discrimination, and our management system, your oversight, failed to catch or prevent it." William exhaled sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Richard leaned forward. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. You failed to properly investigate multiple discrimination complaints against an employee with whom you have a personal friendship. That is a serious breach of your professional responsibilities. William sat up straighter. If you're implying I showed favoritism. The evidence implies it quite clearly, Rachel interrupted, flipping to a highlighted section of the report. Take this complaint from Dr. Amir Shah. He specifically reported being ignored during pre-flight service while white passengers received champagne. Your entire investigation consisted of one conversation with Collins, after which you dismissed the complaint. No witnesses were interviewed. William's face flushed. This is absurd. One passenger's perception doesn't constitute discrimination. Richard's voice was steady. When the same pattern is reported by multiple passengers, it does. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, William spoke. I've been with this company for 23 years. And in that time, you've built a reputation, Richard said, his voice measured. But I will not and cannot tolerate executives who turn a blind eye to discrimination. William's hands curled into fists. What are you saying? Richard's expression didn't waver. You have a choice, resignation or termination. Either way, your employment with Northwind Airlines ends today. For a moment, William just stared. After 23 years? For this? For failing to uphold basic standards of fairness and equal treatment, Richard corrected. For protecting an employee who discriminated against passengers based on race. For betraying the trust placed in you as a senior executive of this company. William stood abruptly, his face red with anger. You'll be hearing from my attorney. This is wrongful termination. Rachel remained unfazed. Actually, it's entirely justified under our ethics policy, which you sign annually, she said coolly. But by all means, pursue legal action. Discovery should be fascinating. We'll need to review every complaint you've handled during your tenure. William's bluster deflated instantly. The last thing he wanted was a deep dive into years of ignored complaints, ones that, under legal scrutiny, could jeopardize more than just his job. After a long silence, he muttered, I'll clear out my office. When the door shut behind him, Richard turned to Rachel. Make sure his system access is revoked immediately, he ordered, and I want a full review of every discrimination complaint his department has handled for the past 5 years. Rachel nodded. Already underway. Richard exhaled. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about breaking a culture of complacency that had allowed discrimination to persist unchecked. The following morning, Naomi Carter delivered her presentation to the partners at Hayes & Carter with her usual poise and precision. If anyone noticed the subtle fire in her voice, they assumed it was fueled by her recent courtroom victory. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan Hayes asked her to stay behind. Once the boardroom had cleared, he shut the door and turned to her. His expression serious. Davenport called me this morning, he said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Heather Collins has been terminated effective immediately, he continued. Sophie Mitchell is suspended pending further review. Naomi nodded. That was fast. Northwind can't afford the publicity if this drags on, Jonathan pointed out. But there's more. They also fired William Fletcher, the VP who protected Collins and buried previous complaints. That caught Naomi's attention. So they're actually cleaning house? Jonathan nodded. It seems that way. Naomi sat back, absorbing the information. A flight attendant losing her job was one thing. An executive being held accountable? That was rare. Davenport's offering more than just discipline, Jonathan added. He wants to work with you. He proposed a complete overhaul of their diversity training, and he wants you to help design it. Naomi blinked. You're saying Northwind Airlines wants to hire me? Not just you, Jonathan said with a small smile. Us. He's open to Hayes & Carter conducting a full-scale review of their policies, training, and reporting structures. He wants real change. Naomi exhaled slowly. Most companies responded to discrimination complaints with hollow PR statements and cosmetic policy tweaks. But this was a chance to change the system from within. A chance to ensure that the next black woman in first class wouldn't have to prove she belonged. She looked at Jonathan, her decision already forming. Tell Davenport we're open to discussions, but we'll be setting the terms. Naomi Carter sat across from Jonathan Hayes, the weight of the past few days pressing on her shoulders. They're cleaning house, Jonathan said, setting his phone down. Fletcher is gone, Collins is out, and they're completely restructuring their training programs. Naomi exhaled. She had expected some action, but not this fast, and not this deep. Davenport mentioned you discussed a consulting role? Jonathan asked. He proposed I help review their diversity training protocols, Naomi confirmed. Jonathan studied her. Are you considering it? Naomi hesitated. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. You know, when I started this firm 30 years ago, I couldn't get seated in restaurants where I now have tables reserved in my name. His deep voice filled the quiet boardroom. Progress happens, but rarely without pressure from those willing to demand it. Naomi gave a small smile. Is that your way of encouraging me to take Davenport up on his offer? It's my way of reminding you that you have an opportunity here to create change that goes beyond consequences for 2 flight attendants, Jonathan replied. Naomi let his words settle. The empty champagne flute flashed in her mind, the quiet, insidious way she'd been told you don't belong here. A message she had heard in 100 different ways throughout her life. Finally, she spoke. I have another idea, she said slowly. What if we approach this more formally? Not just me consulting, but our firm conducting a full-scale audit of Northwind's policies, practices, and company culture. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You're proposing we take them on as a client? Yes, Naomi said, her voice steady. But under our terms, a comprehensive review of their diversity practices, a real assessment of systemic issues, and a detailed remediation plan with binding commitments, not just lip service. Jonathan studied her. And if they decline? Naomi's expression hardened slightly. Then I pursue alternative legal remedies for what happened on that flight, both as an individual and if we identify a pattern, potentially as class counsel. A slow smile spread across Jonathan's face. That's why you're one of our best, Naomi. He picked up his phone. I'll call Davenport now. If this pressure is applied properly, it could be a powerful catalyst for change. As Naomi left the boardroom, her mind was already mapping out the framework for the audit. Her phone buzzed with an email. Subject, Proposal for Consultation, Northwind Airlines Diversity Initiative. From Richard Davenport. She opened it. Attached was a detailed outline of a comprehensive program to address unconscious bias and systemic discrimination within Northwind's operations. The final line caught her attention. Miss Carter, I believe your experience, though deeply regrettable, may become the catalyst for meaningful change within our organization. Sometimes, the most powerful advocacy comes from those who have experienced injustice firsthand. I look forward to your insights. Richard Davenport, CEO. Naomi found herself smiling as she stepped into the elevator. The champagne denial that had sparked this entire chain of events now felt like the first domino in something much bigger. She had always believed in the power of individual actions to create systemic change. Now she had the chance to prove it. A moment of reckoning. 3 weeks later, Sophie Mitchell sat nervously in the Northwind Airlines corporate office lobby, waiting to be called in for her disciplinary hearing. The past 21 days had been a blur of anxiety, shame, and painful self-reflection. She had replayed the events of Flight 368 countless times, each review making her more disgusted with her own complicity. During her suspension, she had completed the first phase of Northwind's newly revised cultural sensitivity training, an intensive program that forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about implicit bias and systemic racism. The facilitator, a Black woman with decades of experience in corporate diversity work, had been both challenging and compassionate, pushing Sophie to examine the beliefs and assumptions that had led to her actions on that flight. A receptionist appeared. Miss Mitchell? Sophie stood quickly, clutching her hands together. They're ready for you now. She followed the receptionist down a quiet corridor to a conference room where 5 people waited. Rachel Simmons from HR, Linda Monroe from Customer Experience, 2 executives she didn't recognize, and Naomi Carter. Sophie froze in the doorway, her pulse spiking. She hadn't expected this. Please, come in, Linda said, gesturing to an empty chair. Miss Gate, Carter has agreed to join us for this portion of your hearing. Sophie moved stiffly to the seat, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. Miss Mitchell, Rachel began formally, as you know, this hearing will determine your future employment with Northwind Airlines. Before we proceed with questions from the panel, Miss Carter has requested the opportunity to address you directly. Rachel turned to Naomi. Miss Carter, you may proceed. A long silence. Then, Miss Mitchell, Naomi said evenly, I'd appreciate it if you would look at me. Sophie hesitated. Then, with effort, she raised her eyes. What she saw wasn't the anger she expected. It was something more complex, a studied neutrality underscored by keen observation. Naomi's voice remained measured. I've read your statement, she said. You acknowledge that you followed Colin's lead in denying me equal service despite knowing it was wrong. Is that correct? Sophie swallowed hard. Yes, she admitted. Naomi studied her. Why? Sophie hadn't expected that question. She had prepared for accusations, for anger, even for a chance at forgiveness, but not for this direct demand for self-reflection. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. Finally, she spoke. I was afraid, she admitted, of losing Heather's approval, of getting bad schedules, of being labeled difficult. She exhaled shakily. But that's not an excuse. I had a choice and I made the wrong one. Naomi nodded slowly. Yes, you did. A pause. I'm curious. Given the same circumstances today, what would you do differently? Sophie thought carefully before answering. I'd serve every passenger equally, regardless of what a senior colleague told me. And if I saw someone being treated unfairly, I'd speak up. She hesitated, then added, and I'd apologize, immediately, instead of waiting until I was forced to confront what I had done. Naomi's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Linda Monroe interjected. Miss Mitchell, as part of your disciplinary recommendation, we discussed a formal apology to Miss Carter. Would you like to offer that now? Sophie turned fully to Naomi. Miss Carter, I am deeply sorry for how I treated you on that flight, she said, voice thick with emotion. My actions were discriminatory, hurtful, and unprofessional. There is no justification for what I did, and I won't insult you by offering excuses. I can only tell you that I am committed to ensuring I never repeat such behavior. A long silence. Naomi studied her. Then finally, she turned to the panel. I believe Miss Mitchell is sincere, she said. That doesn't erase what happened, but it does suggest a capacity for growth. Rachel nodded. Thank you, Miss Carter. Sophie felt her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. She wasn't off the hook, but maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to be better. The conference room was silent as Naomi Carter studied Sophie Mitchell, waiting for an answer that went beyond rehearsed regret. You acknowledge that you followed Colin's lead in denying me equal service, despite knowing it was wrong. Is that correct? Naomi asked, her voice steady. Sophie's throat was dry. Yes, she managed, barely above a whisper. Naomi didn't look angry, she looked expectant. Why? The word hung in the air, heavier than Sophie had anticipated. She had prepared for accusations, for anger, even for forgiveness, but not for this, a demand for real self-reflection. Her pulse pounded. I was afraid, she admitted finally, of losing Heather's approval, of getting bad schedules, of being labeled difficult. She paused, then swallowed hard. But that's not an excuse. I had a choice, and I made the wrong one. Naomi nodded slowly. Yes, you did. She leaned forward slightly. What would you do differently now, if faced with the same situation? Sophie took a moment to think, measuring her words carefully. I'd serve every passenger fairly, according to our service standards, regardless of what a senior colleague instructed. And if that created conflict, I'd report it to management immediately. She hesitated, then added, and I'd apologize, to you directly and sincerely, for any harm I caused. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. Like you're doing now? She asked, with the hint of a challenge in her tone. Sophie shook her head. No, she admitted. What I'm doing now is damage control after getting caught. A real apology would have happened on that flight, the moment I realized what I was doing was wrong. Something shifted in Naomi's expression, a subtle softening. Before she could respond, Linda Monroe, the chief of customer experience, spoke. Miss Mitchell, as part of your disciplinary recommendation, we discussed a formal apology to Miss Carter. Would you like to offer that now? Sophie turned fully to Naomi, forcing herself to meet her gaze. Miss Carter, she said, voice thick with emotion, I am deeply sorry for how I treated you on that flight. My actions were discriminatory, hurtful, and unprofessional. There is no justification for what I did, and I won't insult you by offering excuses. She took a breath, steadying herself. I can only tell you that this experience has forced me to confront biases I didn't even realize I held, and I am committed to doing the work to ensure I never repeat such behavior. A long silence followed. Naomi studied her carefully. Finally, she turned to the panel. I believe Miss Mitchell is sincere, she said. That doesn't erase what happened, but it does suggest a capacity for growth. Rachel Simmons, the HR director, nodded. Thank you, Miss Carter. Then she turned to Sophie. Miss Mitchell, as discussed in your preliminary hearing, your continued employment with Northwind Airlines will be conditional upon completion of our enhanced diversity training program, a 12-month probationary period with regular performance reviews and reassignment to a different flight crew. Do you accept these terms? Yes, Sophie said without hesitation. Thank you for the opportunity to make amends. As the hearing concluded, Sophie gathered her courage and approached Naomi, who was speaking with Linda near the door. Miss Carter, she said hesitantly. Naomi turned to face her. I just wanted to say, your willingness to be here today to listen to my apology, it means a lot. I know you didn't have to do that. Naomi regarded her thoughtfully. You're right, I didn't, she said simply. Then, after a pause, but change doesn't happen in isolation, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes, it requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations. Sophie nodded slowly. I understand that now. Good, Sophie squared her shoulders. I won't waste this second chance. As she walked away, Naomi turned back to Linda. That was interesting. Linda shrugged. Hard to say. Some people follow through, some don't. But having you here today made an impact, on her and on our executive team. Naomi nodded. That's what I'm counting on. Naomi and Linda moved to a larger conference room, where Richard Davenport and several other executives were waiting. The table was covered with documents, draft training materials, policy revisions, and implementation timelines. Richard stood as she entered. Miss Carter, he greeted her, offering a handshake. Thank you for joining us. Your insights on the preliminary materials have already proven invaluable. For the next 2 hours, they reviewed the comprehensive plan developed by Hayes and Carter in collaboration with Northwind's leadership team. The proposed changes went far beyond standard diversity training. They tackled the root causes of systemic discrimination. A complete overhaul of the complaint reporting system, with direct oversight from an independent review board. Revised performance metrics for in-flight service, explicitly requiring equal treatment for all passengers. Anonymous passenger feedback mechanisms designed to capture experiences of discrimination. Mandatory quarterly training for all customer-facing staff, with real-world scenarios and intervention strategies. A mentorship program for minority employees, aimed at addressing barriers to career advancement. Naomi skimmed the final section of the document. These are significant changes, she acknowledged. Then she looked up. The question now is implementation and accountability. As Naomi Carter gathered her materials, Richard Davenport walked her to the elevator. The best policies mean nothing without consistent enforcement, he reminded her. Which is why we've agreed to quarterly audits by your firm for the next 2 years, with results reported directly to our board. Naomi nodded, satisfied. You know, Richard said thoughtfully, when Jonathan first called me about this incident, I was focused on damage control. Now I see it as an opportunity for transformative change. Naomi met his gaze. That's often how progress happens, she replied. Crisis creates openings that complacency never would. Richard nodded, his expression introspective. My grandfather would have approved, he murmured. He always said the hardest part of being first wasn't the overt racism, it was the subtle, everyday indignities that wore you down. Naomi exhaled. Some things haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe, she said softly. Richard's voice was firm. But they can. As the elevator doors closed, Naomi reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From an empty champagne flute to corporate-wide transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most significant change begins with the smallest act of resistance. Across the city, Daniel Bishop adjusted his tie, preparing for his video call with Naomi. In the month since their shared flight, they had exchanged emails regarding his witness statement for Northwind Airlines' investigation. But today's call was about something entirely different. Daniel's office at Horizon Consulting reflected his methodical personality, modern furnishings, muted tones, every document precisely in place. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline stretched out before him. His screen lit up. Naomi Carter, incoming call. He accepted. Naomi's image appeared, professional as always, seated in what appeared to be her office at Hayes & Carter. "Daniel, thank you for making time today," she greeted him. "Of course," he replied. "How did the disciplinary hearing go last week?" Naomi briefly recounted her conversation with Sophie Mitchell. "She seems genuinely remorseful," Naomi admitted, "but time will tell if that translates into meaningful change." Daniel nodded. "And Collins?" Naomi's expression hardened slightly. "Terminated, as expected. HR discovered a pattern of similar behavior in her file that had been overlooked or minimized for years." Daniel wasn't surprised. "But that's not why you wanted to speak today, is it?" A small smile played on Naomi's lips. "No, it's not." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been working with Northwind on revamping their diversity training program, but I believe we need to go beyond that. Corporate training often addresses symptoms without tackling root causes." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "So what's your next move?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "I'm launching a nonprofit focused on systemic discrimination in the service industry." Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "That's ambitious." Naomi smiled. "It's necessary," she continued, outlining her vision, an organization that would work across hospitality and transportation industries to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. "We'll combine data analysis, policy development, training programs, and accountability mechanisms," she explained. "The goal isn't just to address individual incidents, it's to transform the systems that allow them to persist." She paused. "I want you on the advisory board." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Yes, your expertise in customer experience analytics gives you insight into how corporations think and operate, and you were willing to speak up when many others would have remained silent." Daniel hesitated. "I'm honored," he admitted, "but I'm not sure what I have to offer beyond what any decent person would do." Naomi's expression was unwavering. "That's exactly what you have to offer, Daniel. The perspective of someone who recognizes injustice and feels compelled to address it, even when it doesn't directly affect them." She leaned back. "Allyship isn't a passive role. It's a crucial component of sustainable change." Daniel considered her words. As they discussed the details, he found himself drawn to Naomi's vision, not just for addressing individual discrimination, but for dismantling the systems that allowed it to flourish. Then, Naomi added, "We're also organizing a symposium for industry leaders. 3 months from now, I want you to lead a panel on recognizing and addressing bias in premium service environments." Daniel hesitated. "That's outside my usual territory. I typically advise on operational efficiency and customer satisfaction metrics." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. You can help these companies understand that diversity and inclusion aren't separate from service excellence. They're integral to it." She smiled slightly. "The data supports this, Daniel. Companies with more inclusive practices consistently outperform their competitors in customer satisfaction and loyalty." She was right, of course. His own research had revealed a clear correlation, but he had never specifically focused on this aspect in his consulting work. It was a new challenge, but an important one. Finally, he nodded. "I'm in." Naomi smiled. "We already started, Daniel." Naomi Carter stood at the podium of Northwind Airlines corporate headquarters, addressing a room filled with executives, training staff, and flight crew. "Today marks the official launch of Northwind's revised crew training program," she announced. "This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or improving customer satisfaction scores. This is about recognizing the fundamental dignity of every person who steps onto your aircraft, regardless of their background, their appearance, or the seat they occupy." In the audience, she spotted Sophie Mitchell, now part of Northwind's peer education team, listening intently. Beside her sat Richard Davenport, who had become an unexpected ally, pushing for change that extended beyond surface-level fixes. "The true measure of this program's success won't be found in metrics or reports," Naomi continued. "It will be found in the passengers who never have to wonder if their service experience is being determined by their race. It will be in the flight crews who understand that true service excellence is inseparable from genuine respect for human dignity." As she concluded, the room erupted in applause. Naomi stepped away from the podium and locked eyes with Richard Davenport. "Impressive speech," he remarked. "Thank you," she replied. "You know," Richard added, "when this first started, I saw it as a crisis. Now I see it as a turning point." Naomi nodded. "That's often how real change begins." Today marks the official launch of Northwind Airlines' revised crew training program, Naomi Carter announced, her voice steady as she addressed the packed conference hall. This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or improving customer satisfaction scores. It's about recognizing the fundamental dignity of every passenger who steps onto your aircraft, regardless of their background, their appearance, or the seat they occupy. From her place at the podium, Naomi scanned the audience. In the front row sat Sophie Mitchell, now part of Northwind's peer education team, listening intently. Beside her, Richard Davenport, who had once been reluctant to admit the extent of the problem, had since become an unexpected ally, pushing for changes that extended beyond surface-level adjustments. The true measure of this program's success won't be found in metrics or reports, Naomi continued. It will be in the passengers who never have to wonder why their experience feels different from those around them. It will be in the crews who understand that true service excellence is inseparable from genuine respect for human dignity. The room erupted into applause as Naomi concluded her remarks. As she stepped away from the podium, Richard approached her. "Impressive speech," he commented, "though I noticed you didn't mention the lawsuit that got us here." Naomi smiled knowingly. The class action suit filed by Hayes and Carter against Northwind Airlines had been settled 2 months earlier, establishing a fund for passengers who had experienced similar discrimination and mandating sweeping changes to the airline's training and reporting systems. "Some catalysts are better left unmentioned once they've served their purpose," she said diplomatically. Richard nodded, understanding the delicate balance between public collaboration and private accountability. "Fair enough," he said. "By the way, the board has approved your proposal for quarterly review sessions. They want you to continue consulting on the implementation." Naomi nodded. "I'll make myself available," she assured him. "This is too important to leave half-finished." As the crowd began to disperse, Sophie Mitchell hesitated, then stepped forward. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice careful, measured. Naomi turned to her. "I just wanted you to know, I've been assigned to train new flight attendants on the revised service protocols. Your case study is part of our core curriculum now." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that uncomfortable for you?" she asked, curious. Sophie shook her head. "It's humbling but necessary," she admitted. "My mistake has become a learning opportunity for others. That's something positive that came from a situation I'll always regret." Naomi studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said simply. As Naomi headed for the elevator, her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Bishop. "Board meeting for the foundation at 3. Confirmed participants from 5 major airlines. You started something big." Naomi smiled as she stepped into the elevator. What had begun as an all-too-familiar experience of discrimination had transformed into something unexpected. A catalyst for change that, in its own way, might make the world a little more just for those who would come after her. As the doors closed, she thought about the champagne she had finally been served. Not on that flight, but at the settlement announcement, when Jonathan Hayes had raised a toast in her honor. "To Naomi," he had said, who reminded us that sometimes justice requires not just legal expertise, but the courage to say, "This ends today." The elevator descended, and Naomi prepared to step back into the world. A world that remained deeply flawed, but one where a single phone call could still occasionally bend the arc of justice in the right direction. The story of Naomi Carter and Northwind Airlines became a case study taught in business schools across the country. What began as one woman's stand against discrimination evolved into a wave of industry-wide reform. Other airlines, watching Northwind's public commitment to change, began initiating their own reviews of service protocols and crew training. For Naomi, the incident on Flight 3461 was both an ending and a beginning, the final time she would silently endure such treatment. And the first step toward creating institutional change that would make such incidents less common for others. The nonprofit she established with Daniel's help grew rapidly, developing training programs and accountability systems that were eventually adopted by hotels, restaurants, and transportation companies nationwide. What made their approach unique was its dual focus: addressing immediate discriminatory behaviors, tackling the underlying systems that allowed such behaviors to persist unchallenged. Sophie Mitchell, true to her word, became an advocate for change within Northwind Airlines. She eventually rose to a management position where she could directly influence company culture. Her humility and willingness to learn made her particularly effective in helping others recognize their own biases before they turned into harmful actions. Richard Davenport, who had once viewed the incident as a PR crisis, became genuinely committed to transformation. The photograph of his grandfather, a trailblazing pilot who had faced his own discrimination, still hung in his office. But now, other images hung beside it. Photographs of diverse airline staff and passengers, representing a company finally living up to its stated values, a reminder of why the work mattered. Daniel Bishop watched as their foundation expanded, its influence stretching beyond aviation to luxury hospitality and transportation sectors. It was a far cry from the moment on that plane when he had first witnessed discrimination up close, a moment that had changed him forever. And somewhere, on countless flights across the skies, passengers who would never know Naomi's name received the respect and dignity they deserved. They were served champagne, water, coffee, whatever they had requested, without hesitation, without bias, without the subtle indignities that had once been commonplace. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was progress. The kind that begins when one person refuses to accept what has always been and insists on what should be. For Naomi Carter, that empty champagne flute had become more than a symbol of discrimination. It had become a catalyst for the work that would define the next chapter of her life, ensuring that everyone, regardless of who they were, could take their rightful place at the table or in first class and be served with the dignity they deserved. The influence of Naomi Carter's work was now undeniable. What had begun as a single act of defiance on Flight 34621 had reshaped an industry. Sitting at the edge of a grand ballroom at the Lexington Hotel, Naomi watched as Daniel Bishop stood surrounded by airline executives, engaged in a passionate discussion. In the 2 years since they had founded the Carter Bishop Foundation, Daniel had transformed. From a reluctant witness into a fierce advocate for equity in customer service and corporate culture. "He's quite the convert," a deep voice said beside her. Naomi turned to see Jonathan Hayes, her longtime mentor, handing her a glass of champagne. "From witness to warrior, in record time," he added with a smirk. Naomi accepted the glass, smiling. "Sometimes, all it takes is seeing discrimination up close to understand its impact," she replied. "And sometimes," Jonathan countered, raising his glass, "it takes a lawyer who refuses to accept an empty champagne flute to catalyze change." They toasted to progress, to persistence, and to the power of a single act of resistance. Across the room, Richard Davenport, now a vocal champion for diversity, was speaking with the CEOs of 2 competing airlines, detailing Northwind's transformation. In just 2 years, their company had seen remarkable improvements: higher employee satisfaction, better customer experience ratings, a measurable reduction in discrimination complaints. It wasn't just Northwind Airlines that had changed. 15 major airlines and hotel chains had since implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols based on the Carter Bishop Foundation's recommendations. Meanwhile, Sophie Mitchell, once a symbol of failure, had evolved into a leader of reform. She now led training programs focused on bystander intervention strategies, teaching flight crews how to spot and stop discrimination in real time. Her personal testimony, about failing to act when she knew better, was powerful, making the lessons she taught deeply impactful. And what of Melissa Bennett? After her termination, she had faded into obscurity, rumored to be working for a small regional airline, one that had yet to implement the background checks now standard across the industry. Richard Townsend, the executive who had suppressed complaints to protect his friends, had faced a very public reckoning. An investigative report had uncovered a pattern of misconduct under his leadership, prompting multiple companies to reevaluate their complaint handling policies. Justice had arrived, not just for Naomi, but for the many others who had gone unheard for far too long. As Naomi turned to leave, a young black woman in a Northwind Airlines first officer's uniform hesitated before stepping forward. "Miss Carter?" she said, her voice careful but determined. Naomi smiled. "Yes? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say, thank you. The changes you helped implement at Northwind created opportunities that might not have existed for me otherwise." Before Naomi could respond, Richard Davenport approached. "First Officer Taylor is one of our most promising pilots," he said proudly. "She just completed her first year flying international routes." Naomi shook the young woman's hand. "The pleasure is mine," she said sincerely, "and the credit belongs as much to leaders like Richard, who were willing to challenge the status quo." Richard gave a modest shrug. "I'll admit, being threatened with a class action lawsuit does tend to focus the mind," he said with a grin. They all laughed, the tension of their first encounters long since replaced by mutual respect and shared purpose. Later that night, Naomi stood at the podium, facing a room full of industry leaders. "2 years ago," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I was denied champagne in first class because of the color of my skin." A hushed silence fell over the room. "Tonight, I stand before you, not as a victim of discrimination, but as a partner in progress." The journey from that moment to this one illustrates an essential truth. Meaningful change requires both individual courage and institutional commitment. She outlined the concrete results of their work: revised training programs, stronger reporting mechanisms, accountability structures that actually worked, and most importantly, a cultural shift that had begun to take real root across the industry. But she wasn't finished. "Our work is far from complete," she continued. "For every visible success, countless invisible indignities continue, in workplaces, stores, and yes, on airplanes across this country. True equity isn't achieved through a single policy change or one-time training session. It is built through persistent effort and continuous vigilance." She lifted her champagne glass. "To a future where everyone is served with equal dignity, regardless of who they are or where they sit, not because of corporate policies or legal penalties, but because we have finally recognized our shared humanity." The room erupted in applause. As Naomi stepped away from the podium, she caught Jonathan Hayes' eye across the room. His slight nod conveyed what words could not: pride in how far she had come, and a shared determination to continue the journey. That empty champagne flute on Flight 3461 had been meant as a message: "You don't belong here." But Naomi Carter had transformed it into a different message altogether: "We all deserve better, and together, we can create it." The end.